The sun was beginning to set over the sprawling streets of Toronto, casting long shadows across the city. It was a regular Tuesday evening, quiet except for the usual buzz of downtown life. Officer James, a 10-year veteran of the Toronto Police Service, was on patrol. He was known for his strict demeanor, his no-nonsense approach to law enforcement. What most didn't know, however, was that underneath his crisp uniform and controlled expression simmered a deep resentment, a bias that he had never quite faced, let alone admitted to himself. Before we get deeper into the story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Please comment below. Lizzie was hurrying along the street with her infant daughter cradled in her arms. At 32, she was a fierce, determined woman, well known in her community for her activism. She had grown up in Toronto's inner city, witnessing firsthand the systemic inequalities that plagued Black and Indigenous communities. Now, as a lawyer and advocate, she had made it her mission to combat these injustices. She was on her way to meet a fellow activist when everything changed. As she crossed the street, an argument broke out between two drivers nearby. Lizzie, glancing over, kept walking, her attention fully on her baby. Officer James, who had been stationed nearby, misread the situation entirely. Maybe it was the way Lizzie stood confidently, or perhaps it was something more sinister buried within his own prejudices that caused him to focus on her rather than the actual altercation. James approached with an air of authority, demanding that Lizzie stop. She didn't immediately comply. Her attention was on calming her fussy child. Misinterpreting her hesitation as defiance, James felt his anger rising. "Ma'am, I said stop!" he barked, stepping closer, his hand now hovering near his holster. Lizzie, startled by the aggression in his voice, turned to face him. "I'm not involved in this," she replied firmly, her eyes locking onto his. But her words did not register with James, whose mind had already drawn its conclusions. She was Black. She was in the vicinity of a conflict, and she wasn't obeying him quickly enough. His training told him to assert dominance, to control the situation before it spiraled out of control. In a split-second decision, one that he would later tell himself was justified, James lashed out. His fist connected with Lizzie's face. The impact was swift and brutal. Lizzie staggered back, her body twisting instinctively to shield her baby from the blow. The crowd that had gathered gasped in horror, some screaming, others frozen in shock. But what Officer James didn't know, what would unravel his life in the days to come, was who Lizzie really was. As she stumbled to her feet, blood dripping from the corner of her mouth, Lizzie's eyes burned with a mix of fury and disbelief. Her mind raced, not just for herself, but for her child, for her community, for the countless faces she had represented in courtrooms across the city. Faces like hers, beaten down by a system that refused to see them as equal. The scene exploded into chaos. Bystanders pulled out their phones, recording every second. The narrative of the day had shifted in an instant. The focus was no longer on the minor traffic dispute that had caught James's attention. It was now about the image of a police officer punching a Black woman. A mother holding her child. Lizzie, staggering but unbroken, held her ground. She didn't lash out. She didn't retreat. Instead, she stood tall, her baby still cradled against her chest. Her silence, her refusal to give in to the chaos, was more powerful than any scream. In that moment, Lizzie became more than a victim. She became a symbol. Officer James stood frozen, the weight of his actions slowly dawning on him. He hadn't just hit a woman, he had hit her, Lizzie Thompson, a celebrated civil rights lawyer who had spent her career fighting police misconduct and racial profiling. She was no stranger to the system. In fact, she had won several high-profile cases against the Toronto police, some involving officers not unlike James himself. Within hours, the footage of the incident spread across social media like wildfire. News outlets picked it up, and soon the entire country was watching. Toronto, a city often lauded for its diversity and tolerance, was now at the epicenter of a conversation about race, policing, and justice. James was suspended, pending an investigation. But that was just the beginning. What he hadn't counted on was Lizzie's resolve. She didn't just file a complaint, she led a movement. With the backing of her community and legal expertise, she pressed forward, demanding not just accountability for herself, but for all those who had faced similar abuses of power. The trial that followed was a spectacle. Lizzie, representing herself, stood across from Officer James in the courtroom. The roles were now reversed. The enforcer of the law was on the defensive, and the woman he had wronged held the power. Throughout the proceedings, James couldn't escape the truth that Lizzie so eloquently laid bare. It wasn't just a punch. It was the manifestation of a deep-seated bias that had been festering in the force for years. A bias that had allowed officers like him to act with impunity, assuming guilt based on the color of someone's skin. Lizzie's victory in court was inevitable. The evidence was irrefutable, and public opinion was overwhelmingly on her side. But for Lizzie, the win was more than just legal. It was a moral triumph. She didn't just expose one officer's prejudice, she illuminated a system that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Officer James, now disgraced and no longer a member of the force, would go on to reflect on his actions for the rest of his life. But the true legacy of that day belonged to Lizzie. In the aftermath, she continued her work, not just as a lawyer, but as a leader in the fight for racial justice in Canada. Her story became a rallying cry, a reminder that even in the face of violence and hatred, resilience and truth would always prevail. And the next time someone thought about crossing her path, they'd remember, she wasn't just anyone, she was Lizzie. In the months that followed, Lizzie's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The incident had become more than just a viral moment. It had ignited a national conversation that swept across Canada. The footage of Officer James's brutal strike, Lizzie's resolute stance with her baby in her arms, and the raw outrage that followed became the defining images of a movement. The court victory was significant, but Lizzie understood that true justice extended beyond one officer's punishment. The system that produced officers like James, the training, the culture, the unchecked biases, needed to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. It wasn't enough to celebrate her win. Now was the time to push for real, systemic change. Lizzie's face appeared on the covers of magazines. Her interviews played on news channels across the country. She was the woman who stood her ground, who refused to be silenced. But the deeper truth, the one that resonated with so many, was that Lizzie represented more than herself. She stood for every Black woman who had been dismissed, every mother who had been brutalized, every family that had been torn apart by racial violence. The city of Toronto, already diverse but fractured by its own internal prejudices, was now forced to confront its issues head-on. Rallies were held in Lizzie's name, but they were not just about her. They were about every unspoken grievance, every injustice that had been swept under the rug for far too long. The protests, peaceful yet unrelenting, flooded city streets, demanding not only reforms, but a reimagining of policing itself. Lizzie, never one to back down, took her fight to the top. She partnered with community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights organizations, forming a coalition that sought to address police brutality, racial profiling, and the broader issue of institutional racism in Canada. She drafted proposals for policy changes, calling for mandatory anti-bias training for officers, an overhaul of disciplinary measures within the police force, and the establishment of an independent oversight body to handle complaints against law enforcement. At City Hall, Lizzie became a familiar face. Politicians who had previously ignored such issues now had no choice but to engage with her. She was persistent, eloquent, and uncompromising. "This isn't just about me," she told them in one meeting. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to experience what I did. It's about the thousands of voices that were silenced before mine and making sure their stories are finally heard." Meanwhile, Officer James had become a pariah. The public outcry had been swift and merciless. His once solid reputation within the police force had crumbled, and his colleagues distanced themselves from him. He was a symbol of the very thing Lizzie was fighting against, a system that allowed racism to fester unchecked. But beneath the anger and shame, something had shifted within him. As he watched Lizzie's interviews, read her speeches, and saw the impact she was having, James was forced to confront a truth he had buried deep within himself. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who upheld the law, someone who was just. But as Lizzie's story unfolded in the public eye, James began to realize that he had never truly questioned the biases that influenced his actions. He had been part of a system that treated people like Lizzie as threats, not individuals. He began to wonder, how many times had he assumed guilt because of the color of someone's skin? How often had he acted without truly seeing the person in front of him? Consumed by guilt, James decided to reach out to Lizzie, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. He knew that he couldn't undo what he had done, but he hoped, perhaps naively, that confronting his own racism would allow him to grow. It took him weeks to build up the courage, but finally, he wrote her a letter. It was raw, filled with regret and a plea for an open conversation. He didn't expect a reply, but the act of writing it was cathartic in itself. Lizzie received the letter one quiet evening. Sitting at her kitchen table, she read it slowly, taking in every word. James's words were painful, but they revealed a man struggling with the reality of his actions. Her instinct was to dismiss it, to ignore him. After all, what did it matter if he felt guilty now? But then she thought of the bigger picture. Could this be an opportunity? Could a dialogue with someone like James lead to a greater understanding, a step toward healing, not just for her, but for the entire community? Weeks later, Lizzie and James met in a small private cafe in downtown Toronto. The atmosphere was tense, but there was no animosity. James, dressed in plain clothes, sat quietly as Lizzie arrived, holding herself with the same poise and strength she always had. When they sat across from each other, it was clear that this meeting wasn't about forgiveness. Lizzie wasn't there to absolve him. She was there to help him understand what he had never seen before, that his actions, that day and likely countless others, were not isolated incidents but part of a larger, toxic culture of policing. For hours they spoke. James listened more than he talked, absorbing Lizzie's experiences, her anger, her frustration. He learned about the fear that Black mothers like her carried every day, the fear that their children might be the next victims of someone like him. Lizzie explained that it wasn't just the punch that hurt, but the lifetime of discrimination, of being unseen and unheard that it represented. By the end of their conversation, neither of them walked away with complete closure. But there was a shift. James left with a deeper understanding not just of Lizzie, but of the systemic racism he had been complicit in. Lizzie, on the other hand, left knowing that while change was slow, it was possible. As she walked home, Lizzie knew that her fight was far from over. There were still battles to be won, policies to change, and minds to open. But if she could reach even one person like James, maybe, just maybe, the world would begin to see people like her daughter, in a different light. And in that hope, Lizzie found her strength to keep pushing forward. For herself, for her child, for all the voices that had been silenced. As Lizzie walked away from that cafe, she felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, she knew that dialogue with someone like James was necessary for healing and understanding. But on the other hand, there was an undeniable truth that couldn't be ignored. James needed to face justice. The meeting between them hadn't changed that. It hadn't erased the pain, the punch, or the fact that James had assaulted her while she held her baby in her arms. And no matter how much he had tried to apologize or understand, the reality was that actions like his needed to be held accountable if society was ever going to move forward. The legal system, slow but deliberate, had been working behind the scenes. James had been suspended, but as more details of his past came to light, it was clear that this wasn't the first time his racial biases had manifested in his behavior. Complaints had surfaced. Incidents where James had harassed or mistreated Black and Indigenous people during his decade on the force. These were incidents that had been swept under the rug, ignored by higher-ups who saw them as mere minor issues. But now, in the wake of Lizzie's case, the lid was being blown off. Lizzie knew that real punishment, real accountability, wasn't just about removing one bad cop. It was about sending a message to the entire police force and society as a whole, that racism, especially in positions of power, would not be tolerated. She used her platform to demand not only that James be criminally charged, but that the police department itself undergo a massive overhaul. The pressure mounted. Protests surged in the streets, the calls for justice getting louder by the day. People chanted Lizzie's name, but they also chanted the names of others who had suffered similar fates. Names that had been forgotten or erased until now. Then it happened. James was formally charged with assault causing bodily harm and misconduct in public office. It was the first time in Toronto's history that an officer had been charged so swiftly and severely for an act of racial violence. The case became a landmark, a turning point in the city's relationship with its police force. During the trial, the courtroom was packed with supporters on both sides. Some of James's fellow officers showed up, but they were outnumbered by activists, community leaders, and regular citizens who had seen too much injustice for too long. Lizzie sat with her legal team, her baby daughter at home, knowing that her fight had come to this critical moment. James, sitting at the defendant's table, looked hollow. The weight of everything had broken the facade he had worn for so many years. As the prosecution laid out its case, it became clear that this was about more than just that single punch. It was about the culture that allowed men like James to thrive, unchecked, in positions of authority. Witnesses came forward, recounting stories of racial profiling, of harassment, of being treated like criminals simply for existing in their own neighborhoods. The evidence was damning. Lizzie took the stand, her voice calm but powerful. She recounted the moment James hit her, the fear she felt for her child, the humiliation of being treated like she was less than human. But she also spoke about the larger issue, how James wasn't an anomaly, but a product of a system that dehumanized Black and Indigenous people, that saw them as threats rather than as citizens with rights and dignity. Her testimony was a turning point. It wasn't just about James anymore. It was about every officer who had ever abused their power, every person who had ever been afraid of those meant to protect them. In the end, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty on both counts. James was sentenced to 3 years in prison for the assault, and his career in law enforcement was over. But that wasn't the end of his punishment. The public humiliation, the fall from grace, the loss of everything he had built over a decade, all of it weighed on him as heavily as the bars of the prison he would soon enter. Yet for Lizzie, the trial's conclusion was not a moment of celebration. She didn't feel triumphant as James was led away in handcuffs. What she felt was resolution, a grim acknowledgement that this was only one step in a much longer journey. James's conviction sent shockwaves through the Toronto Police Service. Internal investigations were launched, and officers with records of misconduct were put under scrutiny. A task force was formed to evaluate systemic racism within the department, and new protocols were implemented, including mandatory bias training and a more rigorous oversight committee. But Lizzie wasn't done. She continued her work, pushing for broader reforms. She knew that one officer's punishment wasn't enough. The system needed continuous checks, constant pressure to evolve. Lizzie, alongside a coalition of lawyers and activists, began drafting legislation aimed at curbing police brutality and racial profiling, a bill that would ensure no officer could hide behind their badge again. Months later, Lizzie stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd of thousands. The city had changed, slowly, yes, but noticeably. Conversations about race and justice that were once whispered had become part of the everyday fabric of Toronto life. Lizzie, with her daughter now toddling at her side, looked out at the faces of those who had supported her through the ordeal. "We've won one battle," she said, her voice ringing clear over the crowd. "But there are many more ahead of us. James was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And it's up to all of us to make sure the system we build is one of justice, equality, and accountability." The crowd roared its approval, but Lizzie felt the weight of the task ahead. There would always be more work to do, but now the movement had momentum. It had force, and it had leaders like Lizzie who would never back down. James, now sitting in a prison cell, had all the time in the world to reflect on his choices. His life had changed irrevocably. The system that had once protected him had finally turned on him. And as much as he wanted to believe that his punishment was unjust, deep down, he knew the truth. Lizzie hadn't just been his victim that day. She had become his reckoning. After James was sentenced and the dust of the trial began to settle, life for both him and Lizzie continued down very different paths. Yet the aftermath of the trial would leave an indelible mark on both of their lives, as well as on the city of Toronto. For Lizzie, the momentum grew. She continued her work as both a lawyer and a leader of the growing movement for justice and police reform. Her once small coalition of civil rights lawyers and activists had blossomed into a national force, now known as the Canadian Justice Reform Alliance, CJRA. What started as a local response to her case had turned into a platform for addressing systemic issues in law enforcement across the country. The victory in court had opened doors for Lizzie that she hadn't imagined before. She was invited to speak at universities, community events, and even internationally, where other countries struggling with similar issues sought her advice and perspective. Lizzie's eloquence, her story, and her calm but resolute determination to fight for justice made her a symbol not just in Canada, but globally. Despite her growing public profile, Lizzie remained grounded in the community. She frequently returned to the neighborhoods where she had grown up, giving talks at local schools and offering pro bono legal services to those who needed them. Her commitment to raising her daughter in an environment that valued justice, truth, and equality was stronger than ever. Though the incident with James had been a deeply personal and painful moment, Lizzie had turned it into something powerful, something that was changing lives. Legally, Lizzie wasn't done either. Working alongside other legal minds and politicians, she successfully pushed for the Thompson Law, a piece of groundbreaking legislation named in her honor that reformed police accountability procedures across Canada. It required independent, civilian-led investigations into cases of police brutality and imposed harsher penalties for officers found guilty of misconduct. Moreover, it created new transparency protocols, ensuring that complaints of racism or excessive force could no longer be swept under the rug. The passing of the law was a significant victory, but Lizzie was never satisfied with single wins. She knew that societal change required constant vigilance, and so her work continued, writing, speaking, organizing, always keeping the cause alive. But as Lizzie's life surged forward, for James, it unraveled. Prison was a harsh reality for James. His former identity as a police officer made him a target behind bars, and he quickly realized that the uniform which had once protected him on the streets of Toronto now marked him for violence in the penitentiary. Inmates, some of whom he had once arrested, harbored no sympathy for him. The guards, though professionals, did not offer him any special treatment, and some even resented him for tarnishing the reputation of their profession. James spent his days in reflection, replaying the moment he had struck Lizzie over and over again. What had seemed like a rash, split-second decision had completely ruined his life. His family, once supportive, had distanced themselves out of embarrassment and shame. His marriage fell apart within months of his sentencing. His wife filed for divorce, and his 2 children, now aware of the details of his crime, refused to visit him in prison. The anger and bitterness he once carried turned inward, and he spent many of his nights lying awake, grappling with the man he had become. But in time, something unexpected happened. James began to change. The guilt and isolation weighed heavily on him, but within that dark space, he began to confront the deep-seated biases that had driven his actions. Prison forced him to interact with people from different walks of life, including many men of color. Over time, he realized how limited and prejudiced his worldview had been. Conversations with fellow inmates, some of whom were victims of police brutality themselves, opened his eyes in ways he hadn't anticipated. James started reading voraciously. He picked up books on race, inequality, and the history of systemic racism in policing. He attended workshops and therapy sessions offered within the prison, many of which focused on anger management and racial sensitivity. Slowly, he began to understand not only his individual failings, but also the broader context of a police culture that fostered the very attitudes he had once embraced. One day, after nearly a year behind bars, James decided to write again to Lizzie. This time, it wasn't a plea for a conversation, nor an attempt at reconciliation. It was a letter of full and unqualified apology. He detailed how he had changed, what he had learned, and how deeply sorry he was, not for getting caught, but for the harm he had caused her, her child, and the community. For Lizzie, James didn't expect a response, and Lizzie, upon receiving the letter, didn't feel compelled to reply. But something in her stirred. The letter was sincere. She could sense that. James was no longer the arrogant, entitled man who had struck her that day. He had been broken down by the consequences of his actions, and in that breakdown, something resembling remorse had emerged. Still, forgiveness was a complicated thing. Lizzie knew that she wasn't obligated to forgive James. She had no duty to ease his conscience. But as a lawyer, an activist, and above all, a human being, she believed in redemption, not as a free pass, but as something that could happen when real change occurred. Lizzie decided that James's future was his own to navigate. He would have to live with what he had done, but she would continue to live her life without the weight of his actions hanging over her. Her work wasn't about him anymore. It was about the countless lives still affected by the systems she was fighting to change. And as the years passed, Lizzie's legacy continued to grow. She won national awards for her advocacy, her face gracing stages across Canada as she pushed for deeper, more meaningful changes. But her proudest moments were always at home, with her daughter. She had shielded her child from that brutal moment, and now she was raising her in a world where people like Lizzie could make a difference. For James, the road to redemption was long and lonely. Released after serving his sentence, he lived a quiet, solitary life, far from the city where he had once worked. He volunteered with organizations that helped ex-convicts and spoke occasionally at small events about the dangers of unchecked power and racial prejudice. His journey wasn't one of grand redemption or public recognition, but of quiet reflection, a man seeking to make sense of his past while trying to find a way forward. And so, the story of Lizzie and James didn't end with revenge or closure in the traditional sense. Instead, it ended with accountability, transformation, and the understanding that justice is not a destination, but a continual process. James didn't expect a response, and Lizzie, upon receiving the letter, didn't feel compelled to reply. But something in her stirred. The letter was sincere. She could sense that. James was no longer the arrogant, entitled man who had struck her that day. He had been broken down by the consequences of his actions, and in that breakdown, something resembling remorse had emerged. Still, forgiveness was a complicated thing. Lizzie knew that she wasn't obligated to forgive James.